You're clearly trying to get ahead of the game if you're already looking for fantasy football defenses this early in the season, and it is a very good idea to do that, especially with the new kickoff rules in the NFL. Defenses are even more important than ever before. And you're in the right place because I'll be going over my top 5 defenses in fantasy football this year, as well as 5 sleeper defenses that you can get for the low if you don't want to take a really high draft capital and miss out on those other wide receiver or running back sleepers that you love in your draft. There's timestamps all throughout this video. It'll take 2 seconds to go through the whole thing. If you want to skip through it, I would appreciate if you guys do hit that subscribe button. I've helped hundreds of people win their fantasy football leagues, all for 100% free on this page. I'd love for you guys to join us on this YouTube channel. But the number 1 defense in total of fantasy football this year is going to be the Dallas Cowboys. And I know if you see that Commanders jersey back there, it's going to pain me a little bit, but there is absolutely no bias in this. But they've been a top 2 defense on average every single year for the last 3 years in fantasy football and just NFL in general. And it's really not that hard to believe when you look at the players they have on their roster. I don't even need to name them all. Micah Parsons, all these guys are just amazing defensive players, which is why they've been consistently a good defense every single year. Also, they did only put up 1 fantasy point in the fantasy championship against the Lions. That is keeping their value low, if anything, because defenses are fluky. That stuff's going to happen sometimes. They have a pretty decent schedule as far as fantasy football defenses goes, and their playoff schedule is even better, so I'm fine with taking them number 1 defense easily here. But number 2 moving down is the Cleveland Browns, and this one is especially impressive because they managed to finish as a top 5 defense in fantasy football, despite their offense being absolutely atrocious the entire season. And the reason that's so important is because if your offense can't stay on the field, your defense is going to be on the field the whole time, and that's just more prone to yards, touchdowns, everything that you don't want from a fantasy defense perspective. But luckily that will improve. They signed Jerry Jeudy over the offseason. Nick Chubb should be coming back. Who knows when, but it will be eventually. Jerome Ford's a fine fill-in running back for that. And Deshaun Watson should improve. If he doesn't, we're going to have even more issues because he has not improved in a year and a half, but that's besides the point. They were number 1 in yards per game allowed to opposing offenses, only 270 a game. That is 20 yards a game higher than the team that was at number 2, and that was the Chiefs. They have a great pressure rate, a pretty good defensive line if you've watched any of their games, and they average 2.5 defensive touchdowns a year over their past 5 seasons. Very consistent. You know what you're going to get. Number 3, very quick, is going to be the Baltimore Ravens, and this might seem a little bit low to some people considering they led the league in sacks. They were the number 2 defense in total of fantasy football last year. They also produced 12 turnovers from the defense. That's pretty good. Also ranking number 1. They have a bit of a tougher fantasy football schedule though for the entirety of the season, which is why I have them at number 3. But they have the talent. Their offense is good. Their defense shouldn't stay on the field very much, and when they do, they can perfectly hold their own weight. I'm fine with them at number 3. The 4th best defense this year in fantasy football is going to be the Jets, and I've seen a lot of people hate on them, and I don't really get the reasoning for this. I don't really understand how anybody can say they're overhyped from a fantasy perspective because they allowed the 3rd least yards per game on the season, despite having a bunch of quarterbacks, nothing to do on the offense, just absolute tragedy. And again, it's hard to be a great fantasy defense when your offense is never on the field, but the fact that the Jets still finished as a top 5 defense in fantasy football last season despite having such bad of an offense just shows that their defense can hold their weight. They are good, and they managed to keep pretty much every single game close last year despite all the struggles. That's pretty impressive. They do start the year out with the San Francisco 49ers as their first game, and that is tough, but outside of that, the rest of their schedule is pretty easy. And number 5, the 5th best defense in fantasy football this year is the 49ers, especially once Drake Greenlaw comes back from his unfortunate injury in the Super Bowl. His Achilles should be fully healed eventually, and they do have one of the toughest schedules as far as fantasy football goes, which is another reason why I have them at number 5 and not number 1 or 2 like a lot of people do. The beginning of the year starts out okay. They have the Jets, the Patriots, the Vikings, the Cardinals, but then they have a ton of tough ones in the later half of the season with the Cowboys, the Dolphins, the Chiefs, the Lions. They have the talent, the defense, the offensive coordinator is amazing. I have absolutely no problem with taking them top 5, but please go down and drop a like. It takes 2 seconds. I seriously would appreciate it. It would help me out a ton, and it would help you continue to get fantasy football videos on your timeline every single day. But moving into the number 1 sleeper of this year is going to be the Raiders defense, and I don't really understand how this is possible to be a sleeper defense, but it is. Somehow they're going as the defense 15 on the year despite last season. The defense finished number 1 overall through the last 3 months of the season. That is pretty good, and it helped boost their overall defensive score to the defense 8 on the year. What really turned this defense around is when they brought in Antonio Pierce. He helped elevate the squad an insane amount, and a really good baseline for getting fantasy defenses is getting teams that have a defense first head coach because they're always going to put a priority on that. And outside of all of that stuff, they signed Christian Wilkins onto this team to play alongside Max Crosby. That is an insane defensive front. Just to put that into perspective, Wilkins had 10 sacks last season as a defensive tackle and had the 4th best run grade on PFF. And for a good amount of that year before all of the injuries for the Dolphins, it was pretty much impossible to run on them. A lot of that came from Christian Wilkins. But we get it, the defensive front is good. What about the second half of the defense? The corners, the safeties. They just drafted 2 corners in round 4 and 7 7 of the NFL draft this year, again buying into that capital of having a good defense. And they have some great corners already. Jack Jones, he came over from the Patriots. He was absolutely fine. He actually ranked first in PFF grades for week 15 of the season and had multiple weeks on the Raiders with top 10 PFF finishes. This defense started out the beginning of the preseason going as the defense 19 in fantasy football drafts, but have moved up to 16, 15, and I expect that to keep going up. As of now, as long as they're in the top 10, they easily should be top 10 defenses. Go ahead and pick them up. Number one, best defense sleeper in my opinion. But my second favorite defensive sleeper is the Houston Texans, another one I love for a lot of reasons, with the first one being their head coach. And a lot of people fail to understand that the last month or two of the season really is what gives us a glimpse of what we're going to see for the next season coming up. And if we look at that for this defense, they were the number 2 overall squad for fantasy football in the last 4 weeks of the season. And outside of the fantasy finishes from last year, they made some signings and again put an effort to increase the defensive efficiency. They signed Danielle Hunter, and now they get to stack that with Will Anderson, by the way, the guy that won the defensive rookie of the year. And Hunter was great. He led the NFL in tackles for loss with 23. He had a good amount of sacks too, together under a defensive minded head coach that led the 49ers to a top 3 defense his last year there, and then did all this with the Texans. He's a great defensive coach. They should very much come together, and they're going as the defense 11. That seems a little bit high, but there's only presumably 12 teams in your league, so defensive 11 isn't really that high. But let's say you can't get your hand on any of these other defenses, go ahead and swing for the Miami defense. Yes, they lost some players on the defensive end, but after week 10, they were the number 1 scoring defense in fantasy football. They were 3rd in total sacks on the season, and they stopped the run amazing in the first half of the season. Top 7 in rush yards allowed for the entirety of that year. And Mike McDaniels is a good, smart head coach, and if we know anything about the Dolphins, they are insanely fast. And again, going back to the beginning of this video, the NFL changed the kickoff rules. There's going to be a lot more kickoff returns, and if you use guys like they have that are insanely fast, the defense has a lot of opportunities to get touchdowns more than they did before, especially on kickoff. Oh yeah, and they also brought in Anthony Weaver for their defensive head coach coordinator. It's just a good situation. Everything's meshing together well. He was a beast for his 3 seasons with the Ravens before. He helped develop JJ Watt and a whole bunch of other amazing Pro Bowl Hall of Fame players, if you want to call it that. And you can get all of this as the defense 10 in fantasy football. Again, there's only 12 teams, so defensive 10 isn't really that high. But next up, an absolute sleeper in the defensive slot of fantasy football is the Bears. I love this one. They finished the season absolutely amazing. They were a top 5 defense every single week from week 11 on. And you cannot forget the signing of Montez Sweat. And the funny thing is, I know you see that Commanders jersey in the back. He led the Bears and the Commanders in sacks. Like, that just shows you all you need to know. And the defensive line is very good. They only allowed 86 yards per game on the ground. That was number 1. Tremaine Edmonds, TJ Edwards from Philly, who was top 3 in interceptions last year and 5th in tackles for loss with his first season with the Bears. And all of this managed to happen on an absolutely terrible offense that they had last year. And if we know anything about the Bears, they signed everybody. Keenan Allen, DeAndre Swift, they brought in Rome Odunze, they have Caleb Williams. Like, it's going to be an amazing offense, hopefully keeping the defense off the field as much, making them even more sustainable and decent. But the next defense you need to be drafting, and one that might come as a bit of a surprise, is the Green Bay Packers. Yes, they have had their troubles with defensive coordinators and schemes over the past few years, but all of that is presumably coming to an end. They signed a good defensive coordinator, another safety. The thing with the Packers is they've always had talent. They've just never been able to put it all together. They also drafted a lineman this year, one of the top graded safeties in the NFL draft. This defense is very young and has a lot of potential, but they also have the vets with Jair Alexander and Preston Smith to round it out. They are 100% stepping it up as a total, as a team, as a defensive unit, and Jair Alexander is actually showing up to minicamp for once. If you know anything about him, that is a very rare sighting, and it has to show that this defense and offense is coming together some way. I love the Packers. They're a great defense, especially if you're getting them as the defense 19 in fantasy football drafts right now. I hope you enjoyed the video. I would really appreciate it if you do drop a like, and I will see you guys in the next one coming very soon.